the topic of this afternoon's talk is about what does integration and international migration mean? Because you could listen to our conversations this morning and know that we were all talking a little bit differently about what we meant about integration. So in this paper and in much of my work, I use the IOM's definition of integration, which is, I think, very inclusive, but there's a really important difference here that I'll highlight. The process by which immigrants become accepted into society, both as individuals and groups, the responsibility for integration rests not with one particular group, but rather with many actors, immigrants themselves, the host government, institutions, and communities. So this also relates to other work that I've done about the governance of migration, because it's not just the individual. It's really a whole host of individuals and institutions that are involved in the integration process, particularly for international migrants. There's been a lot of debates in this literature. I don't want to rehearse it right now because there's not a lot of time. But suffice it to say that the specific contribution that we're making to the literature about integration is that we're looking at it slightly differently. Where RUL methodology is very different. We're using a formal social network analysis methodology to look very concretely at what integration actually means to the social lives and the daily lives of immigrants. So we're reframing the meaning and evidence that we're using to document integration, and we're asking similar but slightly different questions. So how do international migrants say that they live in Russia? What are their social interactions, their social ties like? And we're assessing the degree to which the patterns of social interaction and the activities that they engage in reveal the nature of the integration into the host society by national group. That's this afternoon's talk is about national groups. And this is the overall project and the very concrete research question that we have, the social network analysis. We're asking very detailed questions about with whom migrants interact, where they live. The overall question that we asked was to tell us who are the most important people to them while being migrants in Russia. So it's not a friendship circle. It is a personal social network, but it's who's important to you while you're in Russia and experiencing migration. It's a two-level case study analysis. So we have different national groups, which we'll be presenting data by, and they were samples in 3 different cities, Yekaterinburg, Krasnodar, and Nizhny Novgorod. So I wish I could have shown these pictures this morning. We have plenty of them. Oliver recognizes these. I told you I'd say it. These are pictures of how international migrants live in Russia. And I know most of you don't need to see this, but we spent a day wandering around with some Tajiki who were international migrants, and they showed us where they worked, how they lived. It was really fascinating. And so I thought it would be useful while you start thinking about the data that we're going to talk about, how people interact, how hard it is actually for an international migrant to go from place of work, where they live, where they work, to some other place to have social interaction. So this first picture, I'm not even going to try to do this, on the far left for you, we were driving by and a migrant that we were with said, "Oh, I built that house." We said, "Oh, cool, that's a great house." And then he said, "And while I built that house, I lived in that wagon there." Now, this was, I don't know, Oliver, what was like a mile off of the main trunk road where there was access to transportation. We said, "Oh, wow, that must have been really fun living there." Then we drove farther down the road and we came upon that apartment complex to the right, which was in the process of not being built. But they still had some migrants living there. We were assured, no, nobody is living at this construction site. Well, you see those little wagoni on the bottom. If I had access to Oliver's photograph, when you open up one of the doors, clearly people are living there. So this is a picture that's well known for people who know about migrants in Russia, but I want you to have this in mind when we start talking about who do you interact with, how do you interact, because just the spatial location of where people live and work sets up a unique set of circumstances for how they can interact socially. So we decided, and here we're really, this is again like this morning's presentation, we have 3 areas in which we're doing this detailed analysis of evidence of integration in a variety of different ways. The first one is the structure of the social and personal network, the configuration, size, density, geographical location, kind of the basics of social network analysis to get a sense of how people are interacting, how this might have changed. Are they large networks? Are they small networks? And as Julia goes through the slides, she'll explain what we would expect to find for someone who is integrating into another society. The second area that we'll be looking at, well, just briefly, larger networks we would expect to be those people who have integrated to a greater degree because they have more social ties. Hopefully they have social ties in Russia that are meaningful to them. And then the second point, the developing of new relationships and sustaining prior ones while they're in Russia also gives some indication of their level or nature of integration. If they're making new social ties that are meaningful to them while they're in Russia, that's evidence of some form of social integration. If they're living in a bubble, so to speak, not necessarily integration, but as you'll see, there's different forms of integration that really come up from the social network analysis. The third area, which we're not going to be able to talk about today, is social and spatial mobility while being in Russia, but there are questions in the survey that allow us to look at that to see, are people moving around the city? Are people using the city? And are there variations by nationality group? And I emphasize that because the way that people were recruited into the survey analysis was by nationality citizenship group, so not by ethnicity. Julia, I think you're up. Yes.
Great, and I want to preface this with I am trained as a network analyst, and so one, I want to thank Beth for pulling me into this project. It's helped me develop some substantive areas of interest, but she's also brought new meaning to my work as a network analyst and introducing me to these ideas that space and place are as important as structure of networks. And so we've tried to incorporate that into this analysis. Evidence on integration. So what we found across nationalities was that networks tended to be not very well connected. There was a lot of evidence of lack of integration, with the exception of one group in particular, Ukrainians, which I'll talk about as I go through these slides. But what we found were networks were not very well connected when they were larger, which is actually perhaps a good sign of integration. So I'm going to go through starting with network structure by nationality. So in our sample, we have Azeris, Tajiks, Ukrainians, Georgians, and Vietnamese. Am I missing? Okay, that's okay. So what we found was that most of these nationalities tended to have very small social networks. So again, these aren't necessarily friendship networks. These are the people that are important to my daily life and getting around. And that there was little integration for most ethnic groups. Excuse me. There were a few really large networks. We allowed people to say, your social ties up to 15 people. Most stuck to about 6 or 7, except the Ukrainians, which tended to have very large networks, 10 to 15, a lot going up to 15. There were also some medium and small networks. What was striking about 2 ethnic groups in particular were that Georgians and Vietnamese were the smallest overall. They had the smallest mean and median size networks out of all of the sample. And so we haven't done a lot of work on Vietnamese, but we would be interested to hear what you think about this. But we have done work on Georgians, and what we found is that normally their networks are about 12 people. And they were much smaller in the sample. I think it was typically around 6 or 7 people that they named as being important to their life and their networks. And so that was a huge difference from other work that we had done previously on Georgians who were not migrants living abroad, but on Georgians that were not migrants. So we thought that this was interesting, that there were these differences in size of the networks. But being a network analyst, I thought, well, what else is going on? because networks are like onions. So we can say I have this many people that are important to my daily life, but what does that structure actually look like? And so we started looking at the diversity of social interactions by nationality. And what we found was that there were really different forms of integration by nationality group. Ukrainians in particular seemed to be more likely to integrate into the host communities. They were going out, they were making friends, involving themselves with locals. And others seemed to form their own communities, their own social bubbles within the host community. So for example, I cite the Vietnamese again because they were so different. All of their social ties that they named as being important to their daily life were Vietnamese. They had no other ethnicities that they interacted with. Well, they interacted, I'm sure, with other ethnicities, but they were not important to the daily life. And so, again, these Ukrainian networks were different. They also had fewer connections among connections, so what we call in network terms low density. So if I know 15 people, those 15 people don't necessarily know each other, which may be good for integration because then I'm exposing myself to different sources of information and different ways of being in the community. Again, the Vietnamese had very high density, so that means everybody in their network knew each other and they interacted with each other, and they were very close-knit groups. And so that was a really interesting finding, even, and I'll show you in a second, among, say, Vietnamese and Ukrainians with the same number of social ties, there were stark differences in the way that those networks were composed, those social ties were composed. Another thing that came up with these migrant networks, and I should point out too that when we asked about the people that were important to their daily life, we didn't limit that to people who were just in Russia. They were allowed to name people that were living elsewhere. And so one of the striking things that we found were there are a lot of transnational ties in the home country, but also that most interactions in Russia are with kin. So one of the speakers earlier today had spoken about people coming over as families and how that's increasing. We're seeing that in this population, and in fact, there are a lot of migrants who have either spouses or even siblings or children with them, and that's who they name as being important to their daily life. Ukrainians, again, were a little bit different. They were more likely, they had kin in their networks, but they were more likely to have friends, more likely to have coworkers, and perhaps more importantly, Russian friends and Russian coworkers. Azeris, to some degree, also had friends and coworkers in their network. Georgians and Vietnamese, again, were the least diverse. Georgians, pretty much all kin networks, so their social ties were with family. Vietnamese the same way, and again, the Vietnamese ties were all Vietnamese. So we thought, how can we put this in a visual display? I'm really into the visual display of quantitative information, and Beth and I have developed a way to look at people's social networks so that we can capture aspects of geography and also structure of relationships. And so what you're looking at may be kind of foreign to you because outside of network analysis circles, we don't see a lot of these, but this is actually a network map. And so in the top corner, we see a red circle, and that's our survey respondent. And this is actually a Ukrainian migrant, a 34-year-old Ukrainian migrant in Krasnodar. And within this circle, he has two friends that he's named important to his daily life that live in Russia. The rest of his network is actually in Ukraine, right? And so these people are all in Ukraine, and they're all pretty well connected with each other, but they're not all kin. We have a friend, there are a couple of different friends in here, and then friends here and coworkers. This person is having significant interactions in the host society with non-kin relations. This is almost exclusive to the Ukrainians. Most other ethnic groups don't have this structure of interactions. This, on the other hand, is a migrant from Vietnam living in Krasnodar, 49 years old. And what we see here, the takeaway, here's the migrant. There are no important social ties located in the host society, and this was also fairly common for Vietnamese migrants. When they did have important social ties located in Russia, they tended to be kin ties. This migrant has a very small network. If we compare it to the size here, this was about 15 people. He's got 4 ties that are important to his social life. They're all immediate family, and they all live in Vietnam. This suggests that perhaps this person is not as integrated into his host society because all of his important contacts are located in another country. The other thing that we looked at, how many migrants have Russians in their networks and other nationalities in their networks? And we had, there was a really interesting finding. There are not a lot of Russian ties within these social networks. But again, the Ukrainians had the largest proportion of Russian social ties. And then the smallest, Azeri, Georgians, and Tajiks, and the Vietnamese had none. Okay, so I'm running out of time. And then there were some other nationalities that were claimed, mostly other migrants. And we kind of looked at this from a social network perspective. Ukrainians seem to be the most integrated, and Vietnamese perhaps the least. The other thing we looked at were developing new relationships in Russia at this point of migration. So some of these people have migrated previously. In this migration, how many of our respondents have developed new ties? Only 13 had, which again indicates that they're not getting out into their host cities. So we have this mixed evidence about integration of international migrants, but looking at the structure, looking at the composition of networks is really important, because we see, again, no new social ties in Russia, or almost none. And that the Vietnamese, even though they look similar to some other ethnic groups, their composition of networks is very different. So, utility of why do we use social network analysis? This gets at kind of the idea of looking at the human experience, migrants as human beings, and the underlying humanity of issues. What is the daily life like for these people? Who do they interact with? Who is important to their life? We feel like that's an important indicator of integration. The other thing, I'm out of time. Okay, that was it anyway. We also have a project looking at mobility of migrants around cities. We see similar trends. Ukrainians are much more mobile than other ethnic groups, and we'd be happy to take questions about that. So,
thank you very much. Please, Cindy. Professor Buckley, now your turn.
I'm going to talk a little bit about remittances from the Russian Federation. I'm going to talk about general flows and individual correlates based on this 3-city survey. And Liz has magically solved all problems again. Okay, thanks, Liz. Okay, and just as, again, I want to reiterate that this work was funded from the DoD with money that was administered by NSF through the MINERVA program. And I want us to remember that one of the biggest issues politically as well as economically linked in with labor migration in Eurasia has to do with this river of remittances. It's viewed with hostility in sending countries like Russia and increasingly Kazakhstan, where press reports often point out the fact that locals feel the country is being stripped of its financial wealth as migrants come in, take jobs, and send money to their home countries. Sending states themselves are increasingly dependent. Tajikistan is in the first place of all recipient countries in terms of the percent of the GDP in comparison to migrant remittances, where nearly half remittances equal almost half of the Tajik gross domestic product. The Kyrgyz Republic is rapidly gaining on them, according to the most recent World Bank reports. What's interesting about this river of financial remittances is that it's increasingly legible. The transfer field is marketized, which is quite surprising. In rural Tajikistan, one finds in a small village of maybe 100 houses, you will find 3 different companies offering money transfer possibilities. It's ironic simply because at the same time transfers are being marketized, the payment of wages for the vast majority of migrants remains as a cash transfer. So the banking system is very, very specific in terms of where it's growing. People are not paid by checks. Migrants primarily are paid with cash, which they then go to these money transfer companies and have electronic transfers set up. Even though it's increasingly marketized, it's still extraordinarily difficult to measure the actual flow of remittances. It's extraordinarily difficult based on aggregate data to divide remittances out from investment transfers, so small-scale investment that gets sent to Tajikistan might be counted as a migrant remittance, where it really actually is not. Small business transfers for the payments of goods oftentimes get captured in IOM statistics as well as World Bank statistics. And more importantly, particularly in Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, recipient families have an incentive to avoid declaring transfers as remittances because they can avoid tax liability that way. But the transfer is enormous, approximately $5 billion. This is by quarter. There's the big dumps in the first quarter of the year. Much of this has to do with the fact that a lot of migrant payments are made in the last quarter of the year. And then the first quarter they don't remit because they're waiting for several months for cash transfers to come in to pay. This breaks it down by the country. Ukraine receives a sizable amount of remittances. This is only from the Russian Federation. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan as well are receiving very sizable contributions. According to the Russian Central Bank, on their prognosis of the migration flows, their estimate is that 72% of all of Ukraine's remittances come from the Russian Federation, 94% of Tajikistan's, and approximately 80% of Kyrgyzstan's. So Russia really is driving the migration market, or the remittance market in this part of the world. Okay? And it's cheap to send money, just kind of surprising. This is the cost of sending $500 US from Russia to various destinations for the first quarter of this year. And again, we're seeing transfer payments all under 3%. Just to give you a little bit of a comparison, if you want to send $500 to Mexico from Champaign, Illinois, you're going to pay 4.5%. So actually, we've got more efficient markets here in the Eurasian network. So financial remittances, are they, as many have argued, the new development mantra? There's 3 different approaches to remittances that can be seen in the literature, actually 2, and one of them starting, thanks to a recent publication. The first one is remittances are indeed a development pathway. Migrants go, they work, they send the money back, it gets invested, people build new houses, they buy cars, they stimulate markets, and magically economic development happens. Another more sanguine look at this flow says that it's a low-level development trap. This is the idea that migrants go, families survive on remittances, but economic bases never get developed in sending countries, and therefore migration is a long-term, long-path dependency. This is why, after decades of constant migration to the United States, more and more Mexicans continue to be dependent upon some form of labor migration. The third alternative, particularly from Eurasia, and this is illustrated in an article published in August in the Journal of Development Studies by Aaron and myself, looks at remittances that support survival, but survival as development postponed. So certainly a good thing when one can feed their family, but they're feeding their family. They're not investing in new housing, they're not starting new businesses, they're not operating bank accounts. That's why you can get the transfers but not the banking. That it's actually development postponed, a sort of low-level survival stasis, as you will. And so taking that as background, we go to the three-city survey. And I just have 2 fairly simple guiding questions in this investigation. First, how does remittance behavior vary across a heterogeneous sample of labor migrants? And the second is, what are the effects of remittances on receiving families? And the goal here is to test patterns we see from the literature in other countries to see how well they predict remittance behaviors in the Eurasian network. So our data comes from the 3-city study. 3 locations, you've already heard quite a bit about that. The survey was conducted in the fall of 2011 and into the early spring of 2012. I'd like to thank Alex for his heroic work, as well as his colleague Natalia Savina, who did a brilliant job in terms of getting this data collected. We employed a modified respondent-driven sampling approach. Specific sending groups were targeted by ethnicity, We did proportionate multiple seating within different ethnic groups in each one of the locations. The method gave us mixed results. Certainly there were advantages over just a plain old snowball sample because we did have a proportionate distribution of initial seeds by ethnicity in each one of the 3 cities that was based on the ethnic composition, as best we could tell from official statistics, of that city. There were huge difficulties in practice. This is a methodology that is often used in migrant studies in the United States. It's pretty much the standard for unregistered labor migrants. But in the Russian context, we ran into a lot of difficulties. This is a particularly difficult population to get at. And so asking for references down the line ended up becoming somewhat problematic. In the 2 cities where we were able to fulfill the respondent-driven sampling method, only the initial seeds ended up generating level 2 respondents in approximately 50% of the cases. So half the time we got one respondent who couldn't then lead us to another respondent. So there were some pluses and minuses with that method that I think Alex is unfortunately all too familiar with. But I think one of the things that we can say as an advantage is that we did an extraordinary job, or actually Natalia and Alex did an extraordinary job of documenting how the sample was constructed. And I think that that's something that's often missing when we do these studies of hidden populations. And so while I don't think we can talk about the sample later, but there were pluses and minuses, but one of the pluses is we have a very detailed record of how the sample was constructed. Measures for remittances. Okay, never mind, Alex, I'll just go fast. Very quickly, we have first migration and the most recent 3 trips. This went round and round because as a demographer, I wanted migration histories from everybody. We also had to think about the practicalities of the interview. I will say by getting the most recent 3 trips, we got, the first trip and the most recent 2 trips, so it's 3 trips over together, we were able to get complete migration histories for over 75% of the sample. So it ended up working out, even though I think I gave Alex a ulcer arguing for those complete migration histories. Remittance behavior, we have measures of the mode, which is the type of transfer, the frequencies of transfers, and the perceived use. What did the family use it for? Did they re-remit the money that you sent to other families, for example? We also have a scale placement of household financial stability prior to the last migration and at present. So they were to put themselves on a 7-step ladder in terms of financial security. We've got a fairly diverse sample, and one of the things I want to point out to you is that clearly these are migrants who are interested in migration. These are older migrants. This is the average age at first migration by nationality in the 3-city sample. And you can see that these are not young migrants on average. There's quite large standard deviations for the Georgians, Azeris, and Tajiks, but with the exception of the Vietnamese, we're looking at people towards 30. And that's the average age of first migration. These are people who are likely to be married and have children. And indeed, of the 67.6% in the sample who sent money home, fully 80% of them had dependent, that means children under 15, within their household of origin. Okay. First cut findings. As I said, just about a little over 2/3 send money home, most through official channels. It's lowest in Nizhny Novgorod, medium in Krasnodar, and quite high in Yekaterinburg. 78% of our migrants there were remitting at home. Migrant age, marital status, and household composition are important factors in determining who does remit. Gender and education, interestingly, are not. So regardless of the education level, that really wasn't helping you predict whether they were going to migrate or not. Ethnic patterning does emerge. Contrary to evidence cited about Georgian migrants overall this morning, the Georgians in our sample have the lowest level of remittance behavior. This effect declines but does not disappear when you control for duration of residence. Tajik and Kyrgyz have the highest levels. So what do we find? Economics matter. When you control for age, ethnicity, and education, those with contracts remit more often. Surprise, surprise. If you have an official contract for your job, you probably have a more stable income, perhaps a higher income, and you remit more. Those with duration between 3 and 5 years remit the most often. So that's the sweet spot. The first couple of years, there's not necessarily universal remittance behavior. Perhaps they're repaying debt incurred in migrating. Perhaps they're getting stable employment. But for any number of reasons, the duration when remittance behavior is strongest is between 3 and 5 years. One can argue there's a selectivity effect. Those that are staying more than 5 years may have lost links with their family of origin, but they also may have children who are now old enough that they're not as reliant on remittances. But overall, in looking at any measure of economic behavior or social integration, the duration of the migration really matters. And so duration is something to keep in mind. Payment mode does not seem to be an important factor. So some use the transfer points, most use the transfer points, but there's a variety of methods that are employed. In terms of family benefits, multinomial logistic models with the household remaining at the same level as the comparison group find the following. So I divided the migrants into 3 groups. One group is your family is worse off in comparison to when right before you migrated. The comparison group, there's no change. And the third group, there was an improvement in where you put yourself on that scale. Duration increases the likelihood that your family status, economic stability status improved. Investments of remittances that occur in approximately 13% of the sample do benefit. If you're able to do any sort of investment, that 13% tends to benefit and see their financial stability increase. Re-remitting increases the odds of status decline. So if they answered that they send money home and their family re-remits it, so they give it to another household, might be parents, might be grandparents, that increases the relative likelihood that that family will experience a status decline. They'll be better off before this person migrates than at the time of the survey. Very quickly, remittance behavior in the Eurasian Migration System is similar in terms of selectivity to patterns found in Asia and Latin America. So there's confirmation here of global theories. Human capital plays a big role, as does the economic setting that migrants find themselves in. Preliminary evidence indicates support for the idea of postponed development. Remittances are being sent. They're being sent at a high level, but they are being used primarily for survival, not investment. So when we look at the development potential, particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, we can think of this as development postponed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't think I need to introduce Professor Ruble.
Okay, that's this one, right?
Excellent.
Well, I want to pick up the theme of this panel. We are obviously beginning to present preliminary results from our survey, and we're going about it by entering the survey findings through different literatures. And the literature which Nikki Krause, Liz Malinkin, and I will be using is out of urban political economy. And I think it gives a different vantage point to look at the impact of migration in Russia. Now, the existing political economy literature on cities often highlights the emergence of local development machines. These are business-dominated coalitions which form to promote economic expansion. And these machines are driven by the need for cities to compete in an increasingly globalized world for financial capital. So much of the discussion has focused on how cities come to manipulate tax rates, change land use regimes in order to maximize the return on business investment. And a lot of the literature highlights ways in which these developments are socially regressive. But the need is real, and a couple of weeks ago at UN Habitat's World Urban Forum, it was clear that there's hardly a mayor in the world who isn't scrambling to try to find new investment in his or her city. There's a dramatic need for investment, and you even have places like Dakar, Senegal, entering the municipal bond market. And what this is doing is it is really changing the drivers of urban policy. But the literature on these issues is really dominated by the North American experience. And the North American experience amplifies the role of financial incentives and private profit maximization for how the 21st century city is shaped. It becomes interesting, therefore, to think about the challenges facing cities which come out of a different environment. Cities which remained outside the global capitalist economy and now are entering the economy. And there's a growing literature on this, particularly focusing on South Africa. But we want to argue that there are examples which can enter into the discussion based on the Russian experience. And even at the micro level, if we think about what Cindy had to say about the marketization of remittances, we see the steady encroachment of global economic forces in affecting behavior. But what we also see, and I think the three of us are going to argue, we can see in relation to tolerance and migration, we also see that the international business community, as it becomes involved in societies where there weren't markets before, which were closed off, can actually begin to promote policies which advance the quality of life of residents. And that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about how in environments in which human capital is more scarce than financial capital, the game of development becomes how do you attract and nurture human capital, and therefore the interventions being promoted by pro-business coalitions are different than in environments in which financial capital is more scarce. And Russia seems to be a very good case to examine these issues. And we do so by using a concept of diversity capital. And diversity capital, as you see, is the notion that there exists a repertoire of equitable responses to diversity. It can be formal and informal, and these responses produce environments which are congenial to a variety of residents. And it's like social capital in that it can be invested, it can be squandered, you can accumulate diversity capital. It's not simply a set of assimilation or integration policies. It focuses on the dynamic nature of how diversity can expand options in communities. And we're going to hear from Liz Malinkin in a moment about the environments in the three cities we're studying, Krasnodar, Nizhny Novgorod, and Yekaterinburg, and then Nikki Krause will return to the issue of diversity capital. But it's not just that we need to think of the relationship around diversity as dynamic. And it's not simply that diversity exists. We all know that diversity exists in many Russian cities, and indeed is much more of a quote-unquote normal condition than a lot of the discussions about diversity in Russia might suggest. The real challenge is how to build upon, how to leverage this diversity to the advantage of a community. As Phil Wood and Charles Landry have argued, the fact of diversity is an insufficient condition to promote economic development. The real issue is how can you accumulate diversity dividends in order to have an long-term economic impact and advance the kinds of development agendas that these emerging business coalitions would want. The issue is long-term accrual of urban social credits, as it were. And with that, and it also means expanding from a short-term time horizon to a long-term time horizon. So with that, Liz will walk us through what we found in the 3 cities.
Thank you, Blair. So even though migration policies are dictated on the federal level in many countries, including Russia, the local context makes a significant difference, which is what I'm going to focus on right now. The 3 cities in our study, Krasnodar, Yekaterinburg, and Nizhny Novgorod, which you can see Krasnodar in the bottom in the southern region, Nizhny Novgorod in the Volga, and Yekaterinburg in the Urals. We chose them both for their geographical variation, but also to get a spectrum of high, moderate, and low migration levels, which would be Krasnodar, the high, Yekaterinburg, the moderate, and Nizhny Novgorod, the low. Each of these regions differ in many ways, from their ethnic composition to the demands on their labor markets, to the policies of the local government, and their practices towards migrants. So I'd like to briefly give a profile for each of the cities that helped shape our expectations from the survey data. The vast majority of migrants to Russia come from the former Soviet republics, and we looked at the ethnic makeup of the 3 regions to get a sense of the demographics of the communities they are joining. As you can see on this slide, as of 2010, all 3 of the regions were predominantly Russian in ethnicity. And you can also see that in each of the regions are targeted groups, namely Ukrainians, Azeri, Tajik, Georgians, and Vietnamese. They all comprise less than 2% of the population in the 3 oblasts, because the statistics are done by oblast, which is a region in Russia, not by the cities. And Sverdlovsk, by the way, that's where Yekaterinburg is. That's the name of the oblast for Yekaterinburg. With about 88% Russians, Krasnodar Krai was the most ethnically diverse of the 3 regions. Sverdlovsk Oblast was about 90% ethnic Russian, and Nizhny Novgorod was the most ethnically homogeneous, with about 95% of the oblast's ethnic Russian. If we think about Krasnodar Krai's geographic location, it has several ports on 2 seas and has a rich history of migration starting from its founding. But the more experience with migration could have had a positive or a negative effect on the local population's approach towards migrants. But in Krasnodar, there is a clear history of intolerance towards newcomers that has been demonstrated through the Krai's laws and newspapers. And interviews by the research team showed a mix of attitudes. For example, one representative of the Georgian diaspora spoke very positively about life in Krasnodar. As you can see this quote up here, "You have no problems if you have a passport. It's all about being competent, or gramotny in Russian. Just follow the rules. Life is better here for minorities because we are used to it." On the other hand, another migrant from Ukraine commented that while the Ukrainian migrants integrate quickly and even assimilate, most migrants from Central Asia do not. And they said that they are not ours. They live separately from us and do not feel at home here. So quotes such as these made it clear that different ethnic groups had very different experiences in Krasnodar. As for Yekaterinburg, it was closed to foreigners during much of the Soviet period due to its military factories, and for that reason, it has a much more limited history of migration. Since the end of the Soviet Union, when it reopened to foreigners, it has been transformed into one of Russia's leading financial centers. Its growing economy requires a larger workforce, and the local press provided much practical information for migrants, revealing an attempt to create an attractive environment for workers in growing industries. Interviews with local residents in Yekaterinburg revealed a pragmatic approach to migration and migrants. For example, a member of the Azeri diaspora commented that it's all about the money. If you have a shop at the market, people will ignore your nationality. Representatives of NGOs characterized the region as being very tolerant and blamed the media for stirring up interethnic tensions whenever there were conflicts between people of different ethnicities. And I know Ombudsman Merznikova has worked very hard on these issues. I'm very pleased to have her today. And then moving on to Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod has a similar history to Yekaterinburg in that it also was closed to foreigners during the Soviet period and opened up again in the 90s. Today, the region is known for manufacturing and finance. Nizhny Novgorod's newspapers revealed a high demand for migrant labor, combined with strong attitudes against illegal migration and a focus on crime by migrants. So its press was very mixed of positive and negative views of immigrants. When our research team interviewed local residents in Nizhny Novgorod, many of the responses revealed a lack of cohesion between the local population and the migrants. As one migrant put it, "We have been coming to this country for decades, but we do not have a place here. We make our own. We make our schools, our protection, all our own." And a professor at the university described local attitudes as being largely indifferent to migrants, saying, "Migration will never appear among the top 5 social problems in Nizhny Novgorod. We have many other problems that people would mention first." From our background research, Yekaterinburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and Krasnodar emerged as more to less welcoming to migrants, respectively. And Nikki Kraus will now talk about our hypotheses and what the migrants' responses to the survey can reveal about the levels of diversity capital in each of these cities.
So based on those city profiles, we considered each one of those cities as kind of an ideal type that represented a different level of migration, high, medium, and low, and sort of a different relative level of diversity capital. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Maybe? Oh. I hit the wrong button. No problem. Okay. So our hypotheses are essentially that in cities with higher diversity capital, we expect to see better outcomes for migrants across the board. The 3 major areas we define broadly as economic security, human security, and citizen-like feelings and behavior. So in other words, are they acting and feeling like they're an integrated part of the community? We operationalize those themes using questions on written contracts and regular pay for economic security, experiences with bribery, either seeing it or having to give bribes yourself as a migrant, and also witnessing or experiencing anti-migrant violence. And then in terms of feeling and acting in a sort of near citizen way, normalized interactions with social institutions like hospitals, the Federal Migration Service, employer relations, and how you feel about your work. Do you feel respected, not respected? Do you feel like your work is difficult or not? So in other words, are you acting like a citizen in as much as you're expecting institutions to treat you in sort of a fair and citizen-like way? In Krasnodar, which has high migration, and we sort of conceptualized it as low diversity capital in as much as it's not very welcoming to immigrants in some respects. Economic security, it was nearly tied with Yekaterinburg, with about 62% of migrants reporting having written contracts for labor, which means that it was pretty good. Also, Krasnodar had the highest percentage receiving regular pay in cash. This is kind of contrary to what some of our expectations are, but I'll go over how we interpret this data at the end. In terms of human security, migrants reported the highest rates of both witnessing and experiencing violence in Krasnodar. That probably doesn't really surprise anybody who's studied migrant relations there, but specifically 20% of the respondents reported having experienced violence themselves, which is over twice as high as the percentages for either of the other 2 cities. In terms of citizen-like behavior in Krasnodar, migrants were most likely to report their work as both difficult and not respected. However, they displayed normalized employee behavior by reporting some of the highest percentages of those who would turn to their employer if there was unpaid salary. So the question was, who would you turn to first in the case of unpaid salary? And they said they would turn to their employers, which we view as a way of, that's kind of a normalized thing, right? That's what you would probably do as an employee yourself. In Yekaterinburg, which had medium levels of migration of the 3 cities and relatively high diversity capital, in terms of economic security, both Yekaterinburg and Krasnodar showed the highest percentages of migrants reporting that they work under a written contract from their employer. We view that as a kind of a more normalized work relationship. There's also a high correlation between getting regular pay and having a written contract. However, only 70% report receiving regular pay in cash, which is approximately the same percentage as Nizhny Novgorod. So that doesn't seem to be absolutely wonderful in Yekaterinburg in terms of economic security, but much better. In terms of human security, migrants seem the least likely to face extortion, with the smallest percentages reporting either witnessing migrants being forced to give bribes or having to give bribes themselves. They also seem to be fairly safe in terms of violence, basically tying with Nizhny Novgorod, with a pretty small percentage, about 8% reporting either having witnessed or experienced violence against migrants. In terms of citizen-like behavior in Yekaterinburg, although it had the highest percentage of migrants characterizing their work as dangerous, it also had the highest percentage characterizing their work as respected. In fact, over twice as many migrants in Yekaterinburg characterized their work as respected among the general population as in either of the other two cities. Migrants there were far more likely to turn to institutions as well. Both of these things seem to be high indicators for acting more in a more citizen-like fashion. I'll finish up quickly. In terms of Nizhny Novgorod, which had low migration and mid-diversity capital, Nizhny Novgorod had the lowest percentage of migrants working under written contracts at 33%, the lowest percentage receiving regular pay at 67%. In terms of human security, the most likely to have seen bribes or have been forced to give bribes themselves. However, they don't seem to be facing the same kind of violence as migrants in Krasnodar do. In terms of citizen-like behavior, they're the least likely to act like citizens in terms of interaction with normal social institutions. So they'll turn to either friends and family outside of normal social institutions for help. In terms of our conclusions, migrants in Krasnodar feel and are treated with disrespect from the population, though they do have economic and social behaviors that are similar to citizens. This may be simply because of the sheer number of migrants and the history of migration in Krasnodar. Migrants in Yekaterinburg feel respected, seem to be respected, tend to act the most like citizens. As Dr. Buckley pointed out, we also see the highest level of remittances coming from Yekaterinburg. Migrants in Nizhny Novgorod seem to be the worst off, aside from actual physical violence, because they are not integrated and they're few in number. So unlike Krasnodar, there's no sheer force based on the number of migrants in Nizhny Novgorod. So those few migrants who are there face even more social isolation. The city's practices of not pushing diversity capital further exacerbate this isolation. And then finally, we argue that diversity capital matters. In cities with a history of migration like Krasnodar, the sheer number of migrants might drive citizen-like behavior, may even drive institutions to treat migrants more like citizens because of their sheer numeric force. In these environments, diversity capital is needed less for economic productivity than to assure rights and the confidence that migrants need to be respected and valued parts of the community. It's important if cities want to encourage more productivity, integration, and mutual respect within their diversifying populations. In cities without a history of migration, like Yekaterinburg or Nizhny Novgorod, we see that those local practices of promoting diversity capital matter. In terms of enhancing migrant existence, we see how much better migrant life seems to be in Yekaterinburg versus Nizhny Novgorod, with the latter not promoting those policies and the former doing so. So the lack of diversity capital can keep migrants in these historically closed or low migrant flow areas isolated, insular, and segregated from the population at large. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Nikki. And now, the last presenter. Erin Hoffman. Oh, sorry. Erin.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Cindy, Blair, and Beth, not just for having me at this conference, but for letting me be involved in this project from the beginning. It's been a real privilege to work on it. I want to find the clicker. There we go. So I want to give you a little background of where I'm sort of coming from this paper. The thing that always interests me in studies of migration in Russia or in Eurasia in general is how does Russia compare to other immigration countries like the US, England, France, or Germany, places that have gotten a lot more attention in the literature that we know more about migration there. So I'm interested in how Russia is similar, how it's different. As an academic and a demographer, I want to know what these similarities and differences tell us about migration as a process. So why people migrate and how they choose destinations. from more of a policy perspective, I think it's important to ask what this tells us about Russia. So is migration to Russia going to develop like it has in other places, or is Russia more likely to follow its own path? And what does that mean for how migration in Russia should be addressed? So specifically today, I'm interested in gendered migration patterns. So how does Russia compare to other countries in terms of gendered aspects of migration? Other migration systems, specifically Mexican migration to the US and migration from North Africa and Turkey to Europe, have been described as having a pattern of men coming first. And what I mean by that is that early flows of labor migration were mostly men coming alone, sometimes young single men, sometimes married men leaving their families behind. But in any case, it was men coming alone. And then later, as these men became more established in their destination countries, they started bringing their wives, children, other female relatives to join them. So early on, you had male-dominated migration flows. Later on, you had women becoming more than 50% of immigrants. So we might expect that Russia would follow this pattern too. First of all, like all labor markets everywhere, Russia's labor market is sex segregated. And the areas where migrants work, as we learned from Sergei Ryazantsev's paper earlier today, is that they work in construction, they work in industry, and they work in transportation. Now, there is certainly a growing service sector, and that is more likely to employ women. But because traditionally these jobs for immigrants have been in these sort of male-dominated sectors, you might expect that most labor migrants are going to be men. In addition, research, particularly in Mexico, has argued that these male-dominated labor migration flows are related to the patriarchal norms in the ascending society, so in this case in Mexico. And the major ascending countries for Russia, places like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they're certainly also very patriarchal cultures, so it might be more difficult for women to migrate alone from these kinds of places. So this is why Russia might follow this men-first pattern. But on the other hand, Russia might be different, and here you really have to think about the Soviet legacy. So the Soviet Union was a very tightly integrated country. There are very strong social ties between people in the different former Soviet republics. And in addition, the Soviet Union really heavily promoted women's labor force participation and women's education. Not exactly the same thing as gender equality, but it does mean that women in these countries tend to have very high levels of human capital. So these high levels of social and human capital might facilitate women's labor migration. So I basically have three hypotheses. If this model of male-led migration applies to Russia, we should see a gradual decrease in the proportion of men among migrants, so starting high and getting lower over time. And then in addition, men's and women's motivations for migration will be different. Women are going to be more likely to be tied migrants, migrating not for work reasons, migrating together with their husbands or other male relatives. On the other hand, if human capital is more important, we should see more consistent sex ratios among migrants over time. And the women who do migrate should report higher levels of education compared to men. And then finally, if social ties are important, we would expect to see more men among migrants from former Soviet countries, more men among migrants from the far abroad, so countries that aren't as closely integrated with Russia, more women among the former Soviet countries. I would also expect to see that women report particularly strong social ties to Russia. All right, so this chart is just to give you a bit of background. I don't necessarily think that very many of you in here need it. This is official data on immigrant arrivals to Russia from 1985 to 2010. Black line represents the collapse of the Soviet Union. What you see is that most migration is coming from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Ukraine and Belarus. Consistently high levels through the late 80s and early 90s, peaks in 1994, starts declining, gets down to almost nothing by 2003, and then starts back up again. And in these more recent migrant flows, which I'm sure none of you can see from here, is there is a much larger role for migrants from countries outside the former Soviet Union. This is more official data. This shows the proportion of men among migrants. This is from the Demograficzny Ежегодник, which doesn't have data for all years. I'm hoping to get more, but for now, this is what I have. So from 1997 through 2006, women are the majority of migrants from CIS countries into Russia. Migrants from outside of the CIS are consistently a higher proportion of men. So this provides some support for the hypothesis about social ties being important for women. But in terms of the proportion of men and women in migration over time, it's a little odd. So among the migrants from the CIS, it's about 50%. Then the proportion of men drops lower and lower until it's about 45%. And then around 2006, it shoots up again, going back up to about 55%. Now, I have a feeling that the reason for this is the introduction of new work permits in 2007. So in 2007, Russia introduced a new category of temporary work permits, and they set an incredibly high quota of 6 million, originally 6 million work permits. And so if before then you had these large male-heavy flows of undocumented migrants, I think maybe after 2006, some of those undocumented migrants regularized their status, and therefore you're going to see more men in the official data, even if the actual gender patterns haven't changed. All right. So that's about all we can get from official data. Now I'm going to move on to the survey. And the nice thing about going last is that I don't have to tell you anything about the survey or our sampling. I'm going to assume you all know it. So our survey can't say too much about the sex ratio of migrant flows, since the type of sampling we use, this respondent-driven sampling, does not create a representative sample of migrants in Russia or even in the specific 3 cities we looked at. However, it is worth noting that our interviewers found a lot of variation in how easy it was to sample men versus women across the different ethnic groups, as well as to some extent across the different cities. So you can see that the 2 largest groups in the survey are migrants from Azerbaijan and migrants from Tajikistan. Both of those groups are also very male-heavy. Out of 161 Azerbaijanis, there are about 21 women. Out of 163 Tajiks, there are about 30 women. What our survey really can do that I think is great is to look at the gender differences in the experiences of migrants and gender differences in the motivations for migration. So I did a whole bunch of bivariate tests looking for gender differences. I didn't actually find quite as many as I originally expected, which was interesting in and of itself, but I did find some, and this table shows all the significant differences that I found. So nationality, kind of what I said before, so Azerbaijanis and Tajikistanis, much more heavily male. Georgians and Ukrainians, much more heavily female. So with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, Muslim countries seem to be more representative of men. Other interesting things, the percentage of respondents who are living with their spouse in Russia, men are actually significantly more likely, 53% of men are living with their spouse in Russia compared to only 41% of women. This is interesting because Yulia Florinska's paper earlier today said exactly the opposite thing, and I don't entirely know what's going on there. I think it'd be interesting to look at some more. But this sort of contradicts my idea that women would be more likely to be traveling as tied migrants. There are, in fact, a fair number of divorced women in our sample who are coming by themselves. On the other hand, women are much less likely to call themselves labor migrants. So about 70% of men said that employment was their main reason for migrating. Less than half of women said the same thing. Finally, there's a lot of support for the idea that human capital is important. Women have 45% of our female respondents and only 23% of male respondents reported that they had a higher education. And similarly, women were much more likely to have done their education in Russia. So I think that also speaks to the importance of social ties. Now, one of my first thoughts was that maybe all of these differences were about the nationality difference. So, there are more, you might expect that Georgians and Ukrainians have higher education levels than Tajiks and Azeris, and that's what's explaining things. I actually did some multivariate logistic regressions to see if educational differences and differences in the odds of calling yourself a labor migrant, if the gender differences held even when other things were controlled for, and they did. I'm not going to show you the actual tables because it's a lot of little bitty numbers, but the gender coefficients seem to be robust even when nationality is controlled for. What does seem to be an important variable, however, is the timing of migration. I have not yet had the chance to take much advantage of the migration history data that we have in this survey, but just to give you some idea, this is a chart that divides migrants up by their year of first migration. So what we find is that people who migrated first in the Soviet era were very well educated, so over half of both men and women had a college degree. Very few of them called themselves labor migrants. 1990s, somewhat similar, but basically for men, the level of education is dropping with each successive cohort of migrants, and the proportion of people calling themselves labor migrants is increasing. For women, the educational drop takes a little bit longer and it never goes quite as low. So I think we're seeing that human capital is still really important for women in all periods. But what I sort of think we're seeing is that migrants who arrive more recently are better fitting these traditional labor migration patterns. In other words, men with fairly low levels of education working in unskilled jobs. On the other, then before that, you had more of a sort of Soviet, I guess I would say, stream of migrants. These are people who are better educated, who are coming to Russia either for education or for highly skilled jobs. So I think, and it sort of seems like this earlier period involved more women. This later period is involving more men. So human capital and social ties do seem to be really important in facilitating women's migration, maybe especially from Georgia and Ukraine. But I think the really interesting thing about Russia is that recent labor migration may be male-dominated, just as it is in other migration systems, but it's built on these earlier migration networks that included a much higher proportion of women. So instead of men coming first in Russia, it's almost that women are sort of a reverse feminization of migration. And I think it does, and from what I have been able to do with the network sampling aspects, it does seem, again, and it's hard to say because there were a lot of respondents, as Cindy said, who weren't able or weren't willing to name other migrants. But it does seem that there are cross-cutting things, that people who migrated in the Soviet period know people who migrated later, and vice versa. These aren't totally separate groups of people. In other words, the people who came more recently are building upon these earlier networks. Next steps. As I said, I really want to explore these migration histories more. And I also want to, I'm making this claim that there are two separate migration streams. And I think I need to do a lot more to see how much that's really the case. How different really are these migration streams? So in terms of integration into the Russian labor market, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of networks, do they really all know each other, or are they separate groups of people? But I do think that in general, Russia is an interesting exception to this pattern of men coming first and then being followed by women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to say a few words about this very interesting project. I was the guy who conducted survey for these scholars, and initially I was not very optimistic about the fate of this project. First of all, I believed it was very complicated. It's too complex to the regular survey. Of course, it was much more complex for the labor migrants. For example, I cannot imagine that labor migrant, not very well educated, could fill out the questionnaire, such a long one, and the guy who is not experienced in dealing with interview, with the questionnaires, with any type of this document could spend like an hour speaking with the interviewer. Then I believe that the technology was too difficult for the guys like those. For example, I was, Beth, you remember, I was very skeptical about your methodology. Yes, it was very difficult for me to believe that it will work, but it worked, and it worked very well. Then RDS. Yes, RDS in Russia is something very strange and not very widely spread. Yes, it's kind of unique because there are some organizations who pretend to do RDS methodology, but when you are starting to investigate the document, then you find out that it's just a regular snowball method. Well, and then it was very difficult to combine both questionnaires, the questionnaire of Cindy and questionnaire of Beth, and how to do them together, and then how to work with the results, and many other questions. And what was the most difficult, and why I was most skeptical, it was the ethnic groups of labor migrants. For example, I could not imagine, and not only I, but all our team, we could not imagine how we could find and how we could work with Georgians in the situation when Russia and Georgia do not have a official relationship, and probably 99 or at least 98% of Georgian labor migrants are illegal. And they have to hide, and as Beth once mentioned, in Krasnodar, there is no chance to get them. Well, how to deal with the Vietnamese? And these people, their society is very close, and it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult, almost impossible to come up to them and with some strange questionnaire. Well, what to do with the Ukrainians? It's very difficult to tell the Ukrainian from Russia and from the Russian, and they're very hard to anticipate to find Ukrainians in Yekaterinburg. It's too far for them. There is no reason for the Ukrainians to go to Yekaterinburg. There are many cities much closer to Ukraine borders. But anyway, only due to Beth's and Cindy's insistence and firmness, yes, we could finish this survey. We could supply you with data, and I waited with patience when our dream will come true. And now I see the results. It's very interesting. Thank you very much. But I still have questions. It's technological question. Well, the first one, I understand that it would be very valuable, and it's almost important to make comparisons. To compare a Russian data set with data set of another country. So I understand that the RDS sample, you should use this RDS sample, but do you think that this methodology worked for 100%, or you think it's, or you don't think so?
Yeah. As I said, I think the results are mixed, and I think Alex is bringing up an incredibly important point. This sort of RDS approach is something that is used often, particularly in a lot of studies of Latin American migrants in the United States, where you go in with multiple seeds and you get different groups from different countries, so many Guatemalans, so many from Mexico, so many from Nicaragua, for example, based on best guess estimates from other places. It's extraordinarily time consuming, and I can't stress enough what heroic work Alex and Natalia did. Was there benefit to this? Yes, I do believe there was benefit to this, and we can look at the response chains. We learn a lot about anomie within the population when we get all these bare branches where we're not getting respondents. At the same time, one has to balance it with practicality, with the incredible difficulty that's associated with this. And so I'll talk a little more about estimation later, but I would say, in public, I'm going to say, why, Alex, yes, perhaps that was not the best thing for me to push you on doing. I was wrong, but that was an empirical question. And now we have an empirical answer. And I really appreciate the terrific professionalism with which Apino approached this survey project. I will say, however, there are three things that were great about this and why you don't have to do this and torture your colleagues in the future. The first is, I think now we have some ideas about response chains, and we can do a little bit more work in terms of what does work and what doesn't work in terms of RDS. The second one is that I think that what it gives us here are a lot of untied migrants, right? So we're not just all coming from one or two seeds in a snowball sample. We have a very diverse sample, and people who don't know each other. And I think the excellent work that Julia and Beth pointed out shows you, these are migrants that are not all clustered together and networked together. And so that was really helpful. But it's always cost and benefit. And I hate to say it, but the cost went on to my poor Russian colleagues, and we got the benefit. And I don't think the benefit was big enough to justify the cost.
No, it was very interesting to work with it, and now we have experience. So
we never have to do it again.
okay, thank you. Thank you very much. If somebody have questions, please.
I have some questions for Cynthia. Firstly, did you had research in sending countries? And what do you think about policy of government of sending country about possibility to direct remittances for successful way for develop this country? And other question later? Or no? Second question for Blair and his team. How many migrants on each city you asked? And for me, it's interesting your proportion, because I didn't saw Chinese migrants and Turkish migrants, for example. But Vietnamese present in your research. Why? And my third question for Erin. Did you fix in your research guest marriage for migrants who working in Russia? Because and how labor migration, labor migration influence for divorced? For example, what is demographic cost of this migration? Thank you.
Very quickly, in terms of sending countries, we finished an analysis of 3 waves, along with Erin, of the Tajik Living Standards Monitoring Survey. And again, this is where we developed this idea of postponed development. Our findings on surveys in Azerbaijan are generating the exact same results. However, you're absolutely right. More work on the sending countries needs to be done. Part of the argument is that there is not a good investment environment. And again, hats off to our incredible Russian colleagues who could, with a straight face, ask people if they were thinking about opening a business when they got back to Tajikistan. This generated a lot of laughter in the field, I believe.
To just quickly answer the question that you directed at Blair. Yeah, to just quickly answer the question that you directed at Blair and myself and Liz, it's the same survey data that everyone is speaking about, and so it's essentially roughly 200 migrants per city, so 600 total. those ethnic groups were pre-selected, and so it's not exactly a proportionate sample in terms of going to the city, determining what the proportions of migrants are, and then selecting in that way. Instead, they were pre-selected categories from which they then gathered data for each one of the ethnic groups. So Chinese and Turkish not being in the survey is too darn bad, but I mean, I agree it'd be nice if there were more groups, but those were just the pre-selected groups. It's a good question, though. I keep, the danger is to talk about it as a proportionate sample incessantly, because that's what I'm used to. But I think
on the Vietnamese, I think Beth and Cindy participated in this decision. We wanted to select a group that was beyond the former Soviet Union. And the Vietnamese have on the one hand, they are a visible minority, which also was an issue we wanted to try to capture. And on the other hand, while the Vietnamese community is small, it has had a long presence, and it's been, in some ways, relatively formalized. We did talk about Chinese, as I recall, and our sense was that that's a phenomenon unto itself, in terms of scale, in terms of the multiplicity of pathways from China into Russia, in terms of very high and very low income and Chinese migrants to Russia. And I think we concluded that the Chinese, in a sense, would overwhelm some of the other issues we wanted to look at. But Cindy, maybe you have another.
And to be perfectly blunt, that's for the next project, and we'll leave that to the younger ones who are ready to go dive into that.
I wanted to add, sorry, Cindy, why don't you finish?
Done.
I wanted to add, just to make sure that everyone's clear, this was not meant to be a representative sample. Everything was purposive. So the case study cites the cities, we chose them, and I think that it was Liz who went over very clearly why we chose particular cities, and each of the ethnic groups was chosen for a very particular reason as well. And boy, did we talk about adding the Chinese, and we made a group decision, just like Cindy said, not for this group, but we all had particular interests, and so these ethnic groups were chosen for very particular reasons.
All right, so quickly, the question of marriage. So there were not a whole lot of divorced people in this sample, which, given the countries that they're coming from, is not all that surprising. But there were a lot more divorced women than men. What I haven't been able to look at yet, but definitely plan to, once we get into the migration histories, is whether women are migrating because they're divorced, and so that makes them the head of the family, they need to go off and earn money, or whether they are migrating and that's causing them to become divorced because migration puts such strains on the marriage. And it's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it right now.
Hi, I've got 3 quick questions, particularly from Ms. Carboni. You all kind of gingerly touched upon this, but can you conjecture about sort of the passing effect that Ukrainians can pass for Russians more easily than, say, like Georgians, Tajiks, who have pretty set stereotypes if you go back even to 1960s movies? And secondly, can you conjecture about the post-Soviet dimension of this? Because obviously we have that line that marks the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And in my mind, I'm like, I think I would start looking 18 years after. Because obviously, especially teaching where I teach, now finally I have a generation that I mentioned, Gorbachev, they're like, Gorba who? Right? When I first started teaching, at least they were like 5, 6, 7, 8 when it fell up. So, oh, yeah, we remember him when we were playing. So kind of conjecture about the post-Soviet effect on this research, because I think that's actually what really makes this especially interesting to me, that it kind of, quote unquote, normalizes this immigration effect from the former Soviet Union.
So on the idea, to take your first question about passing, certainly Ukrainians are probably more likely to integrate because they look more like Russians. The Georgian situation is also delicate because of political tensions. In network analysis research, we tend to find that people stick together. So this idea of birds of a feather, people either flock together because of some physical characteristic, whether that's race or maybe it's education. So people who are like each other are more likely to become social ties. Ukrainians looking like Russians probably doesn't hurt their efforts at integration. So,
Yeah, on the passing issue, one reason why we chose Ukrainians was precisely because we wanted to try to find a group that wouldn't visually stand out. One of the interesting, coming into this, I had been involved about a decade ago in research in Ukraine. And the one outlier group among every dimension one can think of were African migrants. And they were an outlier also in an interesting way. They were in some ways more integrated into Ukrainian society. They were much more likely to work with Ukrainians, to be married to Ukrainians, to have been educated in Ukraine, to have lived in Ukraine for a long time. So on the one hand, in the Ukrainian experience of a decade ago, the Africans represented a migrant group who by every indicator should have been more integrated into Ukrainian society than anyone else except for the color of their skin. And they were the respondent group that reported by far and away the most problems. What was interesting in the Ukrainian sample also, the most successful economic group were the Chinese, who were the most recent migrants. So I think one thing that becomes clear, and this leads to the post-Soviet context, there are really important issues surrounding the ways in which this migration experience is similar to and different from that which we find elsewhere. And that's the theme that's been running through the whole day. And it's not, and these are differences that need to be interrogated. And they have tremendous policy outcomes, particularly for the Russian Federation, and how it thinks about how to respond to the reality of migrants living in Russia. There are ways in which all of these patterns are very, very similar to what we see every place else in the world. But there are peculiar ways in which the Soviet experience changes the reality, and even 20 years later. And what we hope with this research is to begin to interrogate what those similarities and differences are. It's not enough to say Russia is its own universe, it has its own way forward. No, this research clearly shows on this question that's not the case. But it's also not enough to say, well, you have seasonal migration patterns in Siberia that are similar to those in the Southwest United States. No, that's not the case either. And that's what makes this a really interesting case. And I go back to where I began in political economy literature. The really stimulating literature is coming out of South Africa, where you have cities that are joining the global economy and acting as if they're part of the global economy, but with the twist of having come out of an authoritarian insular past. And I think that's really where the intellectual payoff is for us.
Right, and in addition, obviously with the Ukrainians, it's a passing effect, and we can show with their social networks that there's a much higher degree of integration, just as we expected. The larger social networks, the presence of Russians in the social network, the presence of new social ties. So the Ukrainians have a very different integration experience from a social network analysis perspective than the other ethnic groups. So is this just a post-Soviet effect? Well, by design, we looked at a post-Soviet effect. We didn't talk about the sample in great detail, but it is specifically meant to be a sample of migrants who entered Russia after the Soviet Union. And in the case of the Georgians, we very explicitly gave a date, because if we gave an earlier date, we would be capturing refugees, people that had moved to Russia as a result of the wars in in Georgia. So we didn't want to include the refugees. We tried to define the labor migrant as best as we could. And one of the things that we're able to find are these bubbles. And the degree of the bubble is different depending upon the ethnic group. Using the Georgians as a case again, they're mainly illegal migrants. So they're really in a bubble. The Tajiki also, we had a lot of issues there. They went underground during the middle of our survey. So the social, the political context, as Blair is saying, is really important to interpreting our data.
Can I add one more just really quick thing empirically? So using multinomial logistic regression also on some of those questions that I asked about written contracts, like are you more or less likely to have written contracts? Ukrainians across all 3 cities were more likely to receive regular pay in cash. So we can see that as evidence of some positive Ukrainian effect. However, also Ukrainians were far more likely to report being hit up for bribes. So that could also be an effect of being more regularly paid. So you're passing, but you're also passing.
Right.
So.
Right.
They're more integrated.
Yeah, you're more integrated. Give me a bribe.
Okay, I think we finished.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Alex.
Really interesting on this.
So we're